I think first of all, we just have to admit that sometimes even if I teach my best lesson and do my best stuff, it doesn't always, land with everyone.
What?
I know.
I have never. No.
Speak for yourself.
So,
Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of reflection and collaboration as we seek to keep growing as teachers. This podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 123rd episode of the Hallway Conversations podcast. My name is Matt Beamers.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
Our podcast is brought to you by our friends at the Center for the Advancement of Christian Education. We're always looking for topics of conversation and feedback, so please email us at hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. That's hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. Your feedback and your ideas are important to us. Friends, today we are joined by Erik Ringsby, a professor in the special education program at Dordt University. Woo! Erik, thanks for being with us.
thanks for having me.
Erik, we know that you are passionate about young people and helping them succeed, and I'm just wondering if you can start by sharing a little bit about your journey into education and then special ed. I know for many of our listeners, you are new to them, and just share a little bit about your story.
Sure. So I got interested in education, honestly, because my dad's brother, Bryce, was an art teacher at the high school I attended. And so Bryce was just like a second dad to me, and we ate lunch in his room every day.
I
just
love that.
Spent a lot of time with him. And it was, my senior year after I graduated, he decided to leave teaching, and he started working at a camp for adults with developmental disabilities. And it was a Christian camp called Christian Beret. And for many of these adults, it was like their only vacation they had. And so I served as a counselor there for 2 years, and really just, fell in love with serving individuals with disabilities, and just felt a calling. And probably part two of that is, just with my dad growing up, my dad, he really, IDEA law wasn't out at that point when he was in school. So he didn't get access to really the education that he deserved. And that always just kind of sat with me. And I think I realized that more and more as I got older, and just want to make sure that students have opportunities and access to rigor and high quality education.
Erik, you said when you served at that camp, you sort of just fell in love. You used the language of students or young people with disabilities. Like what did you fall in love with? Or what, when you think back at that time, what sort of clicked for you that made you become so passionate about it?
Yeah, I think it's just this idea of joy-filled work. I mean, the individuals that I was able to work with and counsel, I learned so much from them, just about how to live life, and they just had such wonderful dispositions, and I loved working in community with other people. It was just a very kind of collaborative setting, and I just became interested in that part. It was fun. I like to have fun. And
You do. I can say that. Yeah.
He might be Sioux Center's best karaoke singer.
That's right.
And so that was the draw. The draw was really, it was symbiotic, I guess. I thought there was something that I could definitely, hopefully bring to the table, and then I knew I was going to learn from them.
Yeah, and thinking about that, you talked about, hey, I learned so much about life from them. What did you learn about, or what have you learned about yourself, whether back then or just even over time?
Yeah, I think what I've learned just in, particularly in schools, is I worked primarily in middle school, and a lot of times students that I had really hadn't always had super positive experiences.
In school.
And so I really wanted them just to view themselves as a student, and really wanted to figure out, God's given us all gifts. What are your gifts, and how can I illuminate that? And so that was really just part of what kind of kept me going, and just to watch kids kind of recognize and see their gifts. And it could be a variety of things, It could be within the classroom, like, we really worked on studying something and they saw a lot of success, or maybe it was interpersonal, maybe like relationships and resolving conflicts was something that was hard for them, and we worked through those things. Or a lot of times, like I coached 7th grade track for 20 years, and for the, for the first time, for a lot of them, they never done this before. And when kids figure out like God's gifted them in something, it's pretty fun just to watch them blossom. So I enjoyed those aspects.
Well, I love that you mentioned the coaching aspect. I know you and I've talked about that before, the opportunities that you've had to come alongside kids. I mean, to support them academically, yes, but in like more an all of life kind of way, because they're whole people. Could you speak to that a little bit too?
Yeah, I just think it's so important. And I think that's one thing I like about school. Just, even from like, I was a homeroom teacher, and we would do dorky things in our homeroom and have competitions and do that. At the time I was teaching, we had fun field trips where we went like skiing, and we had roller skates, and I'd throw those on in the hallway and just have fun. But really, I coached volleyball, and I coached basketball, and I coached track, and so just seeing, and I saw a difference sometimes too in like maybe how a student viewed themselves. Just in terms of maybe as an athlete versus a student. And I just wanted them to see that they could be both. And that we could have a supportive environment where they could grow and flourish. And I liked the creative part of trying to figure out the best ways to work together to make that happen.
Yeah. Erik, you and I have talked a lot about, because we shared a class that we taught, so continuity literacy, and you and I have talked a lot about the importance of language and literacy across all subjects. I know you worked as a middle school instructional coach and focused a lot on helping classroom teachers improve that aspect of your instruction. What tips would you give high school, middle school teachers who are trying to reach students who struggle in that area? Yeah,
I think the first tip, maybe that I would think about is just like, I think the answer does a lot of times lie in the room. Sometimes I think we lack an imagination for how we might be able to serve students. And also, you don't have to do this alone. I think that's really important to know that we can work in teams. But as we've talked about before, I'm pretty passionate about language comprehension. And a lot of times when things break down, you're trying to kind of figure out where that might happen. It could be vocabulary. Kids have very wide background knowledge pieces, or it could be just things with language structure. So I love looking and trying to predict, like, when I teach this lesson, where might this break down, and what can I do to make that more comprehensible? I just really think that's part of just what we could do to teach Christianly, just to try to help that input to be comprehensible to kids, and to provide a way where they think like, yeah, I can do that. I can get in the learning pit and be successful.
Erik, I'm just thinking about this idea of imagination, and maybe the idea that sometimes we can lack imagination, but I'm also picturing a teacher at the end of April, beginning of May, they're tired, they're on their own, and not in a negative way, but them being, how I don't have the energy to be imaginative, or like, what does it even mean to be imaginative? Like, what encouragement would you give to those teachers about like a place to start in terms of growing their imagination?
I really think it's important as we get toward the end of the year just to think about, to kind of save some of your things that you know are really highly engaging, and to also save some, to have some predictable routines and things that are fun. I think those make a difference. So I remember for our homeroom, I was the team leader, and we just scheduled a day where we had 3 different teams, and we just organized a variety of games we had at the park. And some of them were just kind of, goofy games, but we got out of the building because we all needed to get out of the building, and we needed to do something fun. So I think just being mindful of just even some of those schedule changes, and I think getting up and moving and doing things that are interactive are really helpful. I think it's, you can really lose some energy at the end of the year, but I just think having those types of things can make things go a little more smoothly.
I'm also just thinking about this idea of like routines doesn't mean lack of imagination. Routines are important. Can you just talk about that? About, just the importance of routines or protocols and how they actually might be helpful for students?
For sure. I always like to think of I like to divide my class period, if it was a 45-minute class, to just divide that into 5-minute increments, because I like to change kind of input and mode to keep things interesting. Even teaching here at Dort, I try to be mindful of that because things can get, I don't want to say can get boring, but having some of those predictable things, for example, you might have something like a bell ringer where you get started, but you don't have to do the same thing every time. You can change things in and out. And so I think sometimes knowing what your structure is and then inserting some things in there can help you to be a little bit more creative, because you kind of have that structure to build from. If you kind of think of here's my house and I've got that, it's all framed, and now I get to do the decorative types of things, and those are the fun things, I think, once you kind of figure that out.
So my office is right next to where you teach, and I noticed that part of building your house is having 80s music playing every morning as students walk in. Tell me about your love for 80s music, and also just, I'm just curious, because you're very, it's every day, and I mean that in a good way, is that part of what you're talking about building the house, or is that just something totally different?
Yeah, I mean, I think
and they need an education in 80s music. They actually need an education
it
in it.
is, right? So, And to be fair, I love all kinds of music, but I do love the 80s, and there's just something kind of whimsical about it. And so, it's an early morning class, that I'm teaching. And so I want them to have just some energy, and then I kind of play it up. It's 80s day, and when you got a student that's starting, to sing Careless Whisper with you on a Friday.
Yes.
You're just let's roll, And so I think some of that playfulness is good. There's an education, I remember in Ed Psych, I read a book called The Thread That Runs So True by Jesse Stewart, and he talked about the thread being fun. And so that's just something I want to promote. We can have fun at school. They're not mutually exclusive, fun and learning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They can go together.
Actually, right?
Yeah.
Eric, you've taught for a long time in public schools, and now you're in a distinctively Christian institution teaching here at Dort. Could you share with us a little bit about that? What did your faith look like when you were teaching in a public school setting, and maybe how is it similar and how is it different now that you're teaching at Dort?
That's a great question. I've thought about it a lot more deeply, honestly, now that I've been here at Dort. Right. I think I would say the how you go about your work as a Christian in public education is really important, just because sometimes teaching can really be hard. And so one thing I tried to do, and I feel like I needed God's help a lot with that, was to try to be positive, just to try to see the good that was in our building, and that's for each and every student, to try to figure out what those assets are, and to try to communicate that to students and to let them know that, that aspect that comes out there, that's part of you too. And even working as an instructional coach with other teachers, just sometimes people get stuck. And so being able to do some problem resolving and to move from something where I really wasn't in the existing state that I wanted, the desired state I wanted to be in, and moving towards something more positive was also good. So really just, I don't know, I always thought where is God at work and how can I join? Where is there something that seems like, it just needs to be restored, whether it's I'm not learning well, or there's a relationship, or I'm feeling down, or I'm feeling discouraged. Where does God put you that you can partner with people just to bring more positivity?
Yeah. I really appreciate that, because I think sometimes, I'll say it's based on my own experience. The only time I've taught in public schools was when I was student teaching, which is 30 years ago now, right? And I think sometimes people who've only had experiences in Christian education maybe don't have the imagination to say, like, we actually have similar problems everywhere. And that's what I'm hearing you describe there, right? Because I think for a lot of teachers, they can find themselves in some version of that kind of a place, like, this is the drudgery of it. And to be able to, like, shift your mindset, that really matters. Yeah?
Yeah, it does. And then again, I think, like, yeah, just the how you show up and just the ability to, just to try to see things differently, because there are there are definitely lots of challenges.
Right.
But again, these are challenges that we get an opportunity to try to work toward restoration on, and I think that's part of what's fun, especially when we get students and learning in a positive direction.
Yeah.
Eric, when we're thinking about that idea of teaching Christianly earlier in a conversation you talked, it's more about the how than the what, and I'm just wondering if you can explain that to our listeners.
Yeah, I guess I'd maybe think about it at kind of like 3 different levels. So first, just like at that student level, and I think part of it is just God's designed us all to be unique. And so for me, I think a lot of it is just that noticing just who God made each of my students to be, and bringing out those natural gifts that a lot of them maybe didn't think they had, that they actually had, naming them and letting them know that you've seen that. Everybody, wants to be seen. And so I feel like that's something I can do too. I think part 2 is just that collaboration part. And whether that's just, calling parents and letting them know something, good that their kids did at school, rather than waiting and giving them a phone call when you need to address something. And I found that too. A lot of times some of my students' parents did not have positive experiences at school.
Sure.
And so finding ways to reach out to them and to let them know that we're on the same team, or, hey, you don't want to meet at the school, let's meet up would you meet up at the coffee shop? Or, I know you got to work late. And then also just squashing some of those assumptions sometimes that parents don't care when they do.
Right.
And, I think just having positive presuppositions that parents and kids and even the community is doing the best they can with the resources they have,
Right.
I think is really important. And I think the third part is just that systems piece, and did a lot of systems work in school, and really looking at how we respond to the academic and the social and the behavioral and the emotional needs of students, because that can be really complex. But I think sometimes we expect a lot of students, and I think the kindest thing we could do a lot of times is teach. If you don't know something, well, let's work on it. Let's teach it. And let's not assume that you're doing that to try to, make my life difficult. Kids really, they do the best they can with the skills they have.
Eric, I'm thinking about this idea of parents doing the best they can, or students doing the best they can, and I imagine over the years you've had to have hard conversations with parents, maybe conversations that led to them being surprised or even disappointed, or even anything like that. Like, what wisdom would you give educators about, hey, entering into hard conversations with parents? Because they love their kids, even if it may look different. They hopefully want the best for their kids. I believe that of most or all parents. But when you have to have a critical or hard conversation with parents, I don't know, can you share a little bit how you went about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first is, I hope at some point we have a relationship before we have these conversations. And that's not always possible, but when it is possible, I think that's good too, whether it's just, you're being visible and you see them at, the basketball game or the track meet or out in the community. So I think that's one. I think also just, presuming sometimes people say things that seem like they're kind of hurtful, but really they just have their students, their kids' interest in mind. They just love their kids. And so I'm a parent and I can relate to that, and I can understand just how I can be passionate. So not to read that emotion sometimes as a personal attack. I think it's really important just to ask questions and to make room for them to speak and to have them share their perspective, because honestly, they know their kids better than I do. And so just that idea that I can learn and that I don't have all the information.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. We're actually all in
None
this
of us
together,
do.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Eric, thinking about schools and structure, you talked a little bit about systems thinking. Can you talk a little bit about like a response to instruction model that you've seen and how that might benefit? Some of our Christian schools aren't used to thinking about interventions systematically for students. Can you kind of talk about a response to instruction model and how that might look and how we can benefit from that?
Sure, love to. I think first of all, we just have to admit that sometimes even if I teach my best lesson and do my best stuff, it doesn't always, land with everyone.
What?
What?
I know.
I have never. No.
Speak for yourself.
So that's the first one. But I think you need to really be clear on just, if I'm teaching a standard, to being really clear on here are the learning outcomes that I'm trying to measure and trying to look at. Because I believe you can respond to an outcome. It's hard to respond to a whole standard. It's hard to respond to a grade. It's hard to respond even to a product or a project. And so I think we have to make some really good judicious decisions on just what we will respond to. And, I think, God's given us some really good analytical thinking skills, and we have some really good structures in place just in terms of understanding progressions of learning. And we need to do this collaboratively. So it almost look like, you and I are teaching this week and really looking at, hey, what are these big outcomes that are really important that if students don't get, I'm going to teach again? And then finding ways, I like to use the term elicit evidence, and to see, sometimes did it stick? Throw it up against the wall, did it stick? And if it didn't, then we need to do things. If it's that important, we need to find some ways to reteach that. And that might be like, I got a block class. I don't need to use the whole 90 minutes just up in front of students or even doing whole groups or even, kind of things for everybody. I could bring in a small group of students and I could work with them. And it's really about just being responsive to the learners, but you can't do everything. And additionally, sometimes the problem isn't academic. It could be something going on with the behavior. It could be something's going on socially or emotionally. And so we need to try to pay attention to those things too, because kids they're embodied individuals. They bring their whole selves to school. Yeah. And brokenness can happen in any of those things. And so it's a challenge to try to notice, but that's why that teaming is so good, just to look and see what's going on and to work together and to try to be imaginative in how we can be responsive. But we should be using data, Right. And again, I don't mean data like necessarily in a spreadsheet, but just an agreement on like, hey, this is what we know proficient student work would look like. And then, trying to think of different ways to do it.
If we don't get there, how do we have to respond to that and improve it and reteach it so that we can get there?
Right.
So based on what you're saying, though, like having a really clear learning target seems like that's going to be really important. Like we need to know what the objective is so that we can keep moving forward. And then to agree on here's what evidence of proficiency at hitting that target's going to look like. Yeah?
Yeah, for sure. And there's just different things depending on what kind of learning target it is. If it's a knowledge target, you can do some pretty quick things with that. If it's a reasoning one, it might be me having a conversation with you.
Right.
There's different ways. If it's a performance, I can watch you do something. And I think if we really thought about it, it's pretty intuitive, right? So like if I'm the basketball coach and we get out rebounded by 25, on the offense, we're going to work on rebounding that next practice. And we kind of need to think about our classrooms that way too and think like, hey, what is it? And again, it might not even be an academic thing. It might be, Erik was off task the whole time here, and I got to try to find a way to engage him. What's going on? What's going on there? So.
Erik, one of the things I've enjoyed since you've come to Dort is sitting next to you at professional development learning, because I've noticed, and I mean this in a good way, you mutter to yourself a lot. And you'll be like, well, and then I'll be like, what did you just say? And it's actually brilliant. Like, I learn a lot from that. And one of the things I've learned from you is language matters. How we talk about students. Like this word, we have to be careful because it's code for this word. And I know that's really important to you, like passing that on to your students about the importance of language. And I'm just wondering why that's so important to you and just a word for us as educators. What can we learn about that?
Yeah, I think it's important because sometimes there's just kind of underlying assumptions that go with that. And I think it stems from the fact that I want all students to have access to high quality education. And a lot of times there's factors and things that are beyond students' control. And so, if we use a term like, here comes Erik, he comes from the rough side of town, that doesn't mean, that it could mean a variety of things, but what I don't want it to mean is he doesn't have a chance to learn because the cards are stacked against him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I want it to be like, yeah, he might have some challenges, but that doesn't mean that he can't, that we can't have high expectations and high support for Erik, because we need that. Like, I was a student that needed that, and teachers poured into me and believed in me, and I think that's really God's good design, is for us just to see, again, we're just that potential, right? And that's what we want to bring out. So I just don't want to lower expectations for students, and that's personal to me, and because it really has profound effects on life outcomes for students. And I want students to have access. Sometimes I like to use the term like, hey, we got to figure out where the entry point or the on-ramp is for you. But we can do that, and I believe you can do that, and students need to believe that too.
Erik, sometimes I feel like maybe we undervalue the importance that educators make in a child's life. And you just referenced like your own story and teachers who believed in you. And maybe just as we begin to close this, I'm just wondering if you can share a little bit about, a teacher that saw things in you that you didn't see in yourself, or that somehow, believed in you, I guess. And because it's not just a cliche.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think back to one of my middle school teachers, Mr. Sculler, and he just had fun. He told the funniest stories all the time. If I'm honest, I got in a lot of trouble in his class sometimes. So if you tipped back in your chair, the natural consequence was, well, you can sit on the floor. And so I spent quite a bit of time on the floor. If you talked, he thought he'd expand your vocabulary by sometimes copying whole pages out of the dictionary. So I got up to about maybe 12 pages before I got a reprieve. But then at Family Fun Night, we thought it would be fun to TP Mr. Sculler's house while he was there, and he totally knew that we did that, and he swore he'd get back at us. He's like, you might eat lunch one day and find a goldfish in your sandwich. So every day
checking your lunch.
We were looking. But I think what it was, and I had him for basketball too. He was my basketball coach. He had really high expectations, and he expected a lot from me, but he also saw my potential, and I knew that, and I knew he was fair, and I knew he cared for me. And I think it was just that combination of just kind of tough love and fun and rigor and fairness that I just thrived on and I needed, and I still remember to this day.
Sounds like he had a good imagination for you and what you could be. That was beautiful. Friends, we know your time is valuable, and we want to thank you for joining us today for another hallway conversation. And whether it's this day, this week, or this month, we hope the Lord gives you what you stand in need of, and we'd like to send you from here with this blessing. So to our listeners, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you his peace, and give you his peace, and give you his peace. Amen. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you have a good week.
Thanks for being here, Erik.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erik.
This podcast was literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Hey, we have a favor to ask of you. Would you be willing to rate this podcast or write a review in your podcast app? Or if you found this conversation interesting or helpful, would you consider sharing it on your social media? Those things really do help podcasters out, and we would be so, so grateful. Thanks for listening, friends.
Am I on, Dave?
You should be good to go.
I didn't hit mute by accident?
No,
Right.
we've done that before, too. There was one time, did I ever tell you that?
No.
Oh, I was able to fix it because I corrected, but it was like we'd hit mute and we recorded like 10 minutes of an episode.
Oh, wow.
Actually, I think it was Abby's that was muted for
Oh, no,
10 minutes.
of
No,
course.
it was okay. And it ended up fine because then I just like adjusted.
Cross-referenced
and
it?
and
Yeah.
it ended
So
up
the red
fine.
button should be on.
It should be on, but not flashing. If it's
Yeah.
flashing, you're muted.
Okay, it's on.
But I can also see that on my screen if things go weird. So
All right.
that was fun.
All right, here we go.